I first want to say thank you, Tina. What a delight it is to be back here, and specifically as a part of the Anderson Lecture Series, because as a doc student, this is like what all the big shots were doing. So either I don't know, it makes me feel like a big shot. I don't know if I am a big shot, but I like the idea of being associated with this wonderful lecture series. I think the last one I attended was James Luna, and it was amazing. I want to start by giving a little bit of background on about myself, but there's also something that's kind of funny that I want to share. Last night at we had like a potluck at the graduate, it was like with graduate students, and many of you may know Steve Carpenter, but he said, I'm not going to be here tomorrow, and I got something going on in University of South Carolina. And actually, I thought it was April Fool's. Like, I thought he was joking, because he did this really great presentation. He and I go back 27 years. I counted it up. So I was kind of excited, not that you didn't do well, but I was excited about the idea of Steve and I considering our history of him introducing me. So in honor of Steve's absence, this is the day the program Steve and I, here's Dr. Carpenter here, 27 years ago. I think he has jams on, I'm not sure. And here's me looking like one of the New Kids on the Block right here. But it kind of speaks to something I want to talk a little bit more about. And it's this kind of heartfelt truth that I had an absolute amazing art education. And I think one of the things that makes it amazing is that a good deal of it took place outside of the conventional classroom. So anyway, it also brought to mind the fact that my presentation did not have a colon in it. And what kind of academic does that? So last night I was kind of laboring over potential post-colon words that might pull things together or speak to the breadth of what I want to talk about. One of the things that I'm going to get into a little bit is this developing theory about related to plate tectonics. I'm talking about identities, and I think Charles Gararian might talk about these as glomerates, but things that kind of move in relationship to each other. And the lithospheric plates, when we talk about colliding plates or converging, diverging, transforming plates, sometimes they slide. Sometimes they just miss each other. Sometimes they create mountains, eruptions, transformative reactions. And I like to think that our identities sometimes function in that way. Some of our identities coalesce very well, but some of our identities may not work very well. And in my view, there are many pedagogical sites that emerge from the relationship between the identities within us all. But that's not my post-colon title. Then I decided, well, maybe it's this idea. Graham said a couple of days ago in our one of the graduate seminars, research is 95% management. So well, maybe what we're trying to do in our efforts to actualize is we're managing all these identities in relationship to one another so we can be productive global citizens. Then I thought, maybe we're mining identities. I like this idea of gold panning, this idea of thinking about when identities fall to the bottom, when identities rise to the top, and our efforts to kind of keep pace with that which confronts us. And I think that's the one I want to go with for this lecture, because pacekeeping is really important to me as it relates to my practices. People come up to me all the time, and they do, I guess, at NAA or something, and when I talk to them about my work, they say, you work so hard, you're so prolific. And the truth of the matter is I don't really work that hard. I just work a lot and a little bit very often, if that makes any sense. So it's the idea of stop staring at the top of the mountain if you're a doctoral student. It's not going to help you to lament over where you think this journey is going to take you. The important thing is to just get up in the morning and think about it and talk about it and do a little something about it. So pace is going to be a part of this lecture as well. A little bit more foreshadowing. I said I had this amazing art education, but I think it would be remiss for me not to just briefly go over some of these experiences because they eventually relate to my identity because they're part of my cultural history. I started at a place called the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild a long time ago, and I come from a humongous Pittsburgh family, which is really important. I have 7 brothers and 5 sisters. I have 50-something nieces and nephews. My father comes from a family of 12. My mother comes from a family of 13. It's madness. And here I was trying to make objects that are very breakable as a developing artist. And also objects that are, thought of as having a level of intimacy and connection. And it's not an easy thing to think about that kind of intimacy and connection when you don't have your own room, and you never have. So at any rate, I started at a place called the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, which was pivotal for a lot of reasons. I was talking to Grace Hampton yesterday, and she knows that my story is kind of told in conjunction with Bill Strickland's story, who's a renowned activist, entrepreneur, educator from the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild. And I said that, and his story is the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild had this transformative experience on me. And in some regard, that's true. But the reality is everyone has a transformative experience from age 14 to age 18. I grew up in the arts. It's not like the arts hit me like a light bulb. It was always there, and I was always attached to it. So in some ways, it was a very natural progression. And I'm not discounting these things, but you grow up seeing flowers in the yard, you plant flowers in your yard. If you grow up and you don't see anything but ruins, it's not unusual for you to have a life that's kind of glorifying ruins, which is sad. At any rate, they had these wonderful workshops that have kind of changed in format. But as a result of my experiences there, I made a lot of connections with a lot of people. And the format of the workshops was oddly me, which was part of a very small cohort of high school students, a bunch of retired hobbyists, tons of art teachers who were pursuing, Act 48 accreditation, they call it here, right? Renewal credits, et cetera. So it created this interesting intergenerational, multicultural, it was all of those things. But again, the common denominator for us was making. And making set a certain pace that in some ways masked a lot of the associated weirdness with what I was doing. So I tried to take friends down there, like, I want to make pots with a bunch of old white ladies. What are you doing? But there was something there that helped me focus enough to eventually open up to other possibilities. And these are just a bunch of random images from that time period. This is a collaborative work with me, a bunch of high school students, and Philadelphia artist Sid Carpenter, who we brought in for a collaboration. At the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, we had really high standards for ourselves because the artists that we brought in our work was held pretty much in the same esteem as artists. So if they brought in an internationally renowned artist and they had a jazz trio and a catered event and freshly painted pedestals, they did the same thing for us. And that also kind of carried over into the standards that I had for my own work and for my students subsequently. These are works of mine from high school. Is the light good for everybody? Can see and everything? Just a hair, please. Thank you. So anyway, this kind of idea, and it's somewhat Piagetian, that the more we see, the more we want to experience. Our thirst, our curiosities, all these things are fueled by an ever-changing landscape in which we exist. And if our landscape changes, we become accustomed, or we may even thirst for a changing landscape or a shift. So the idea of having the rug pulled from under me, or being compelled to join another community, to reconcile my work with another facility, to travel abroad, all these things kind of stemmed from me being pushed as a student at the Manchester Guild. So here are all the programs that I was with which I was associated with as a high school student. And again, it didn't seem very amazing to me, but when I look back on it, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of stuff for a high school kid to get involved in. And all of these things tell different stories as it relates to connectivity, pros and cons of arts programming, benefits. And again, this is my art education history. And I have this at least this piece, to really reflect on from the perspective of a professional, but also kind of channeling my value system as a high school student. I went to Slippery Rock University. Steve and I both went to that university, and we had a really kind of a wild card professor named Richard Wukich, who was really interesting. Well, he's still very interesting, but really tenacious and interested in international programming. It seemed like if there was a war breaking out, he was there trying to start an art program. This guy was like really, like seriously. So he started the program in the former Czechoslovakia, and a bunch of us went over there. And speaking of adapting to other facilities, my interest at that time was primarily in decorative functional pottery. And suddenly I was given the task to make things in a very different kind of facility, very rough, coarse clay. And what I basically kind of did is I started to use clay and drawing as a way of processing ideas and not being so preoccupied with the idea of a final product or utilitarian object. And these are works from my BFA exhibition. This is kind of moving toward grad school. I started making these kind of biomorphic forms, and I came home one day from school, and I was spending some time with my parents over the summer in Pittsburgh, and I looked out the window and I saw this, and it was obviously alarming, but this was to apprehend a 12-year-old boy. And it just really kind of struck me. I took a bunch of pictures from my window, and supposedly he had some information. That's all I really knew about it. But it just really kind of snapped me back in a certain sense to really start thinking about, well, what is the relationship between what I do and what's happening in the world of those who are the closest to me. I had nephews and nieces and brothers who were on those streets despite the fact that I was casting bronze 6 hours away. So it really kind of forced me to think about, my agency as an artist and how that relates or meshes. And it changed the work for a time period. I mean, some of these were more contrived than others, but I started thinking about this notion of social responsibility. And these are some of the works that came from my MFA exhibition. This is called Conviction. And then I made this huge installation while I was a grad student about cultural identity. And this is 2,000 pinch pots. And this piece is titled Assimilation Destruction. And it's looking at the mobility of this clay as a material. And the premise behind it is, as every time you exhibit this piece, you dump it out on the ground and it breaks down. And it's an extension of meaning about what it means to assimilate or what it means to sustain cultural identity. So then I got a teaching job. And again, it really created somewhat of an upheaval if we were to look at the tectonics relationship, because I had my artist liberal lens. I want to do what I want to do. If I want to make new sculptures, I can make new sculptures. I want to make provocative sculptures. But then I had this responsibility to what I thought at the time young people should be thinking about in the ceramic studio. And also the institution where I was working had its mission and its conservatism associated with what kids should be looking at and what they shouldn't be looking at. And it was the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild where I started. So I wanted to at least give them every opportunity that I had plus more. So I kind of created like an open studio atmosphere, which created another kind of rift in my household because my wife was pregnant and needed me at home. And again, there's that challenge of wanting to be a good husband, but wanting to be a good teacher, but wanting to be a good artist. And I endured just by making the pots that came natural to me at the time, that were these kind of ornate decorative forms. And I survived. Some of these are varied in size, but these are like, I always talk about them in reference to sports objects. This is like maybe 2 footballs high. This is almost beach ball size. Pumpkin, a big one. Soccer ball. Another soccer ball. So to me, it was really about trying to teach my students how to throw, how to fire, various surfaces, but I really was not as invested in the idea of conveying meaning or connectivity or teaching them how to relate to functional objects, because I didn't have that kind of existence at this time even. Some large 30-inch platters. Okay, 15 minutes on the backstory. So here we are now talking about keeping pace and identity. So I'm sure there are tons more, but the identities that I really think that I grapple with in my roles are pretty much these, or the ones that are either imposed on me or on some way or another. I'm forced to reconcile these identities, whether it's a racial identity or sexual identity or religious identity. All these seem to be a part of my existence. These seem to affect my daily life more than anything. So if I don't make it to the gym by 8:30, I may not get into the gym. It just happens. If I don't finish up and clean up the studio, and by 2:45 or 3 o'clock, I gotta pick up the kids and get home and cook dinner. These are all things that kind of affect my everyday existence. And I mentioned this idea about identity being something that's, I say, within and without, because we're sometimes compelled to reconcile how other people see us. And the ongoing joke is that I'm Dr. Bay downstairs and I'm Sharif upstairs. So I thought this could be an interesting parallel. And this is like literal. The grad students, they play with that idea because they know me in other ways. They say to me, "How's it going, Dr. Bay? How's it going, Sharif?" So, but really, like, if I have Carhartt on, don't call me Dr. Bay. But the interestingly cumbersome thing is that even within some of these identities are other identities that sometimes conflict. So sometimes being an entrepreneur may conflict with your quest for meaning. Sometimes craft collides with entrepreneurship. And I think that all these things could have it could be a whole nother conversation or another kind of tectonic collide. And I feel the same way about scholarship. And I'm sure I haven't exhausted the subpoints within this, but when I'm editing, I'm not able to find time for writing. And that's a common thing. If I'm going away, sometimes I steal away at the NAA conference and I go upstairs, I get inspired and I go upstairs and spend hours writing. But again, that's at the expense of networking. So it's an everyday battle. So as far as what I hope this lecture will, get us to think about a little bit is, life after college. And I just wrote these. I hope there are no typos. But how will you continue to produce and use art or scholarship to ask important questions of yourself and the world? Which identities support you in doing so? Which collaborate? I'm supposed to have a space here. Excuse me. I mentioned this notion of pace and rhythm because I feel like all of these paces are based on our energy level. There's some things that I can't do no matter what, certain times of the day. I was talking to Dr. Rowling about editing, and for some reason, for me, as like a mentor, I kind of think that's in some regard what certain journals are about. It's about mentoring. It takes me a lot of emotional energy to write up like summative notes of reviewers and communicate something to an aspiring author. And it's just something I can't do 5 of those in a day. It's really weird. Maybe it's just I'm especially sensitive to how people receive that, and it does pay off. People even whose manuscripts are rejected come up to me and thank me, and it lets me know that it's worth that extra mile. But nonetheless, it takes a little longer, and it's always at the expense of something else. So it's like, okay, I'll do 1 review before breakfast. I can come back and do this, and then I can do that. So the story about pace really became much more real when I became a doctoral student here. This is my studio, or was my studio, on Atherton Avenue. Is it Atherton Street or Atherton Avenue here? Street, in the basement. And essentially what happened is I thought I could set up a pottery studio in the basement and I could throw and make functional pots like I love, and it just wasn't working. The demands of that particular vehicle were not conducive to my lifestyle. And not only academically or professionally, but even socially as a father of two at the time. It just seemed like anytime I was able to get any energy going, something was pulling me away from the studio. And I wasn't really able to realize any real pursuit, per se. So I started to devise another way of working, and it kind of happened very organically. But these pinch pots that you saw me making when I was in grad school, I started to produce those kinds of pieces again, and I got to the point where I can create these I can have like a transient existence as a potter and as an artist, and I was not able to realize that if it was limited to certain facility needs. Like if I had a wheel, I had to have it. Wheels are dirty. Wheels make big messes. I can't cart a wheel around the house, but I can cart, 15 pounds of clay and a shipping quilt and a brush and a loop tool. So I started to create these satellite studios throughout the house. And again, about pace, a lot of people talk about arts-based research. I don't know that I'm an arts-based researcher, but I know that the pace of studio production lends itself to certain kinds of reflection that benefit my scholarship. And that's what would happen. I'd go in there, I start making things, and think about my problem statement, or somebody would come in and we talk about it. But I have this idea of making to kind of, in some regard, it creates a sense of order in chaos. It's like all these ideas, but it's like the rhythm section, despite the improv, right? This will embarrass my wife, but this is kind of what her life looked like at this time. And you may not realize this, but my youngest son is like the football, and the two are trying to tackle her, it looks like to me. It's like, so she's running from them. Good memories for me, but anyway, this is the kind of studio production I adopted for that time of my life, and it kind of spawned this very unique body of work for which I became known. Here's another space. This is taken against the Ormsby building down here behind Patterson. This is a commission with the U.S. Embassy in Sudan. Give an idea of the scale of some of these works. But it was really like there's no reason I couldn't be productive in this time, because in some cases, one of these pieces that are mostly the size of a tennis ball took about 2 minutes to make. And it's kind of funny. I was able to get this way of determining how much work I can get done based on certain pre-K shows. So 2 episodes of Dora the Explorer equal how many, one feature-length Lion King means I can produce. And so, like, literally, I was able to, and that became, it's like, all right, it's like, okay, no, Oswald, let's watch Beauty and the Beast, because I know that's almost 2 hours, so. And some of these ideas are kind of nostalgic. I was starting to do some of this stuff in grad school where I would think about more rudimentary methods of working and try to implement them into my current work. I wanted to maintain the texture of this. And it's like when you're a potter, you're always worried about glazing on the lid or glazing something in the wrong place. But I started making these textures and just pouring glaze into them and letting them kind of solidify on their own. My daughter was not happy about taking this picture. It was heavy. And you'll see some of the imagery from this work kind of reemerge. This is a giant piece. It's called, think of it as a giant brooch, but it's called Notions of Others. And here's some other ideas. And again, these are also pieces that I was able to more or less produce at home with very little studio support. I would kind of sneak in and use the kiln when these are all produced at Syracuse. I would just kind of bisque fire work and come back home. A lot of these actually fired in my fireplace as opposed to pit firing or sagger firing elsewhere. Foil sagger, we call it. and I won't really have much time to cover like the conceptual basis of any of these or ideas behind them, but I think the important thing is to understand that they were made, in the house more or less. And, I got a lot of support, obviously, from a lot of people, especially my wife, because she was very open to the idea of me making these little spaces for working. And the idea is that she knows that, again, I'm available. I can still, I'm the primary cook in the house. I can cook dinner. I can do all these things. And I don't get lost in the studio, because that, for me, the notion of working on the wheel has a very different pace, a very different kinds of demand. And it's somewhat hypnotic for me, to where I can go into the studio, and something about those rotations that's just 8 hours goes by and I don't realize it. This is an interesting experience I had as a resident artist at the John Michael Kohler Art Center in the Factory. It's last year this time. Kind of translating my work through slip casting and a very different pace. But again, I adopted to this rhythm that really, again, is kind of conducive to my personality. Because the slip bench in itself is kind of a dance. If anybody ever did any high volume slipping, which is just, it's like watering plants. You wait a few minutes and you go back. You brush all the leaves off. And you say a little, you spray the leaves. There's this kind of motion, and it really became interesting, because prior to that, I made these pieces all individually that you saw, and I polished them and kind of love each bead. And then when I started doing this, somehow the work, that habit kind of found its way back into the work, in that I do a lot of post-firing, polishing, and refining. So despite the fact that they're cast in an industrial facility, I still was able to kind of reintroduce that relationship to the work. So it's not pit-fired, burnished earthenware. It was all done in post-firing, but nonetheless, the pieces were equally considered as individuals, let's say. This is me loading up a bunch of work for the kiln, finishing a piece here. This is me after an all-nighter, my final days there. And as a resident artist at the Kohler plant, it's like, some people say it's heaven for workaholics, because you have 24 hours access, you have all these amenities available to you to just produce. And there's really no significant cost associated with what you make. But again, I still had these other demands. I was fortunate that my wife supported me in going away for a few weeks, but the demands of the journal were consistent. That was kind of like the season of when submissions are coming back in and it's time to send them back out. So coincidentally, there was this 2-hour period during the day where they told me if I don't want to cut my beard, I don't have to, but there's 2 hours a day where I couldn't be in there for health and safety reasons, because I couldn't get a regulated respirator because of my beard. So I said, okay, I can use that time to eat a sandwich and send out a manuscript. So here I am in this lunchroom, all these guys are looking out. What is he doing? I pull out the MacBook and I'm working on reviews. And something had to give. So what pretty much gave is I was really not as invested in cooking at this time. Cooking is a really big part of my life, which you'll see. But I went straight from the studio to the gym, and I'd make an egg sandwich and go back to the studio. And that's one thing I was still pretty much committed to, is writing and working out, despite that I was on this residency. So I kind of foreshadowed the nature of my mom's house and all the kids, and the fact that we still like to think we're in this intimate setting, but there are sometimes tons and tons of people around. And this isn't a holiday, this is just a random Wednesday or something where I happen to stop in there. And just to give you a nature, I think there are 2 kids wrestling in the living room, or people just kind of hanging out. There's nothing at the table that looks like it's handmade or even matching. It's just kind of the nature of that household. Here's a random shot of my mom's porch on a spring day. That's just the kids I can fit into a frame. But it became kind of important to me to think about how to curate or to kind of instill in my kids the importance of object as we relate to food, as we think about these experiences. So fortunately, at least in my view, they grew up curating the table and thinking about what kinds of objects they want to eat from, they want to drink from, and also what kind of setting. So Chinese night, we're going to eat on these cushions, and we're going to have Chinese on this plate, etc. This was supposed to be before that. This is me Skyping my son when I was at the Kohler plant. And again, if you have kids, you always have to try to do everything equal, but things don't always split 3 ways equally. They were counting how many images of each one of them had in the slide lecture. So there's only 3 of me and 2 of you. So, but anyway, here are just some of the dishes I make and some of the dishes we use. And again, my place as an artist right now, it's kind of like the reverse of the John F. Kennedy quote, where it's like not what I can do for art, but what art can do for me. And there was a time where I had visions of grandeur, and I really wanted to I'm going to be in Seeker's. Well, I'm going to get this accolade and be in this gallery and make money off of this. And I'm fortunate that I can make money from doing something that I really love. Art happens to be one of them, but I'm able to sustain myself without really worrying about where I fit. And I think it's more important to me right now to think about how art can teach me humility as opposed to how art can light up my name. And that's really, really important to me right now. And again, also, how can I use my lived history to move a generation forward, namely my kids, to instill in them the importance of sitting down and taking it in and slowing down in an age where we may be feeling like we're suffering from hurry sickness, which is, I think, becoming increasingly common in our society. So speaking of pace and intergenerational exchange and apprenticeship, my kids love my food, which is really an important thing because it means they're going to stay connected to me in some way. But also it means that if I'm not there to make certain things, kind of like me, if you miss Dad's cooking, you need to make Dad's food. So my kids are starting to value that and starting to kind of try to take it in. So this is my daughter making flatbread, frying cod, and under my watchful eye, she's making a pie here. She says, I don't look too pleased in my posture. This is my niece and I'm making biscuits. And to me, for me, cooking is art education. It's about process, it's about honoring tradition, it's about connecting people. And the same relationship I have with my clay elders, who I might call and say, what do you put in this glaze? How might you go about making this recipe? I call my aunt, and that becomes a point of departure for a conversation. I'll say, well, what do you put in your macaroni and cheese? How do you do this? And also the sensorily rich experience. Lowenfeld talks about, in one of the older editions, I believe, about the sound and the texture of black-eyed peas. And again, being positioned to actually see how food evolves from a burlap sack to the table. This is some granola I made a couple days ago, and it reminds me of the work of Vija Selmans. Anybody? Just really intense, almost like photorealistic drawings of the desert's floor or the sky. And again, in thinking about time and also resourcefulness, I'm in an area where people actually fight over fish heads, and I'm one of them. So fish heads make amazing soup and amazing gravy, but it takes time. And again, what are the textures? What are the senses associated with that evolution? And then, of course, in some regard, this whole idea validates the existence of a potter in a way that it really imbues it with meaning, in a way that I always like, am I just a potter? Did I really want my work to mean something? But in the face of our industrializing society, we think a lot about, well, how did the cow live? How did the cow die that we consume? But we also need to think about the objects which we support and how they evolved, how they're made, where they're made, by who, under what circumstances. So it's kind of part of the idea of buying local, supporting things that are made, that aren't made under oppressive circumstances or that aren't detrimental to the earth. Shredded apples, garlic scapes. So about 3 summers ago, I finished up a semester and I just kind of asserted myself in one of the areas of the room and built a little makeshift studio. And I would do that every summer for the last few years, and I would just throw simple functional pots. I like to think of it as frames for food, and not trying to make pots that are the upstaged cucumber salad or the corn salsa, but they're just really simple objects that I'm not even going to really share much of here. But recently, I just kind of left things there and kept making stuff. I think it was after my whole tenure review, I needed to purge, and fortunately, no one's pulled the rug from under it. So there's now a ceramic studio and soon to be printmaking studio within art education for various kinds of exploration. And it's probably what led to me starting to teach studio again, because it increased my year-round presence in the studio facility and started to connect me with students who began to take independent study with me and things like that. And I would just have an annual sale in my yard. And it's usually about 16 hours over 2 days. I just go out there with my laptop, of course, and write, and whoever stops by buys pots. And I find that it's an interesting thing to compare the quality of that experience in relationship to a comparatively hoity-toity gallery reception, where you just have enough time to kind of talk a little bit and hug those you love, and it just keeps moving, and 2 hours goes by like that. I feel like there's a lot of teaching and learning that takes place in my yard during this sale when people stop by with their kids and their elders. And I live in a pretty busy street, so people drive up. So I'm kind of going to get back to this idea of how these things relate. And I know a lot of people have written about artography, and it's that the AART acronym as it relates to our identities. And the more I think about it, the more I feel like, for me personally, my teaching becomes a negotiation of my art and my interests as a researcher. And a lot of a good friend of mine, Gabriel Washington, who some of you know, he kind of called me out one time. He's very frank, you know him well. And he said, why is it that your teaching is so critical and so radical and your art isn't? And he's right. He's absolutely right. That's a really, really good point. I call you a couple times a month and we talk for hours about what happened in the classroom, what didn't happen in the classroom, what else might happen in the classroom. Let's interrogate the language I used. How did that potentially misdirect what could have happened, would have happened? And there's a few people who have on speed dial, and we labor over these things, but I don't have that kind of criticality associated with my studio production. And my answer became, oh, that's okay. It's a different place. It's a different pace. I mean, maybe my artwork is just about keeping me sane. And maybe my identity as a teacher is about asking those big questions. Or maybe, and this is something that Charles said to me when I think I was interviewing here, and I totally dismissed it in my mind at the time. He said something about this notion that teaching and writing is the same as studio production. So this is a quest for meaning. I learned a lot about myself by asking other people questions, by revisiting their biases. Why did that make him uncomfortable? Why did that make me uncomfortable? So teaching becomes a platform for challenging certain ideas, for hashing out ideas, for taking risks, for engaging the world, for all the things that I like to think that I'm working in the studio to do. So the answer is that for me, teaching becomes a place for challenging those conventions. And for me, it becomes a way of thinking about how these identities merge. So what does it mean if I bring the kitchen to the classroom? What does it mean if I bring the classroom to the kitchen? How do people respond to that? My identity as an exercise obsessed person, I guess, I don't know. It's sick, but it's true. What is the relationship between those intersecting identities in the classroom? Is there merit to that? How does that change the way we think about teaching and learning? So in this particular performance, I jumped rope until I smelled like onion soup, basically, and then taught the class. So how does the smell provoke a different kind of reaction to me, who's typically there with a button up and a tie? And it does obviously, well, some of them want to sit near me, but to see me jump rope and sweat profusely in itself created a different set of assumptions to move forward with. How does me bringing my house code identity to the classroom affect how people perceive me and how we interact with each other? What are the associated props, tools? So to me, playing with these identities becomes a part of my teaching, and it becomes a way of revitalizing my approach to the classroom, because I want people to think about that space differently. I want people to think about me differently, because if they think about me as being who they thought I was in 2013 in the fall, when the last time I took my class, they're obviously mistaken, because we're continually emerging and evolving as artists and as people. So what I like to do, like I was doing with my pinch pots and my parenting, I like to see if I can't merge these efforts in a way that makes me productive. So this is like 500 push-ups, 500 T-bowls. And it really wasn't a performance until I looked back on it, but it was a performance just for me. It's like the tree falling in the woods. But I was busy in the studio. I told you about the hypnotic demands. I was like, well, can I continue to stay fit even though I've been here every day for 3 weeks without doing anything? And I started to work out in conjunction with the studio and kind of abandoning the facility on which I depended. It's like I abandoned the potter's wheel at one point. And then I thought maybe I can push that a little further if people allow me. Maybe I can get a tractor tire and store it in the back of the studio, and when no one's watching or when I'm firing a kiln, I can pull it out and do like CrossFit related stuff. And some of these things kind of become wacky, but it's really, for me, just a way of, I guess, surprisingly, I'm becoming like obsessed with efficiency. And maybe that's just the reality of the more time you have, the more time you waste. I don't know, but I think about, how I can find a way to do all these things at once, or to at least make sure I revisit my checklist often enough to where I'm covering the gamut. My wife and I are at present homeschooling my son, so he gets to see all this madness from his own point of view. And we work it out pretty well so far, but he comes to the studio and we have walkie-talkies. So I set him down in my office with his math homework. And it's almost like the Dora the Explorer thing. I think, how many math worksheets will it take for me to be able to load a kiln? So I give him his math work and I come down and check on him. And we have a dance that we have in the studio. I still make pots constantly when I'm really able to, very conventional pots, but it just, something about the process just makes me happy. And that's enough reason for me to do it, obviously. So I don't know what the relationship of the work that I make. I try to make pots that are, for the most part, between $10 and $100, because I want the world to have them, so they're not especially expensive things. I like the idea of producing things to where they almost become expendable. And I like to get back to the idea that like when I was 14, where I could just feel, I think James mentioned yesterday, this idea of just being able to give something and not think about, oh yeah, you know what I could sell this for if I were in a gallery, or how much time I invested in it, but just to make things and to make so many things to where they almost become expendable enough to where you don't even have to think about what they're worth anymore. And they're obviously worth a lot more. Like, to me, it's freeing up bookcase space, but to someone else, it's an honor to have it as a gift and as something they can use in their household. I'm nearly finished. I just said, this is me, a pot I didn't show a whole lot of pots, but this is like a pot I used to make all the time, or a version of it. And I thought about what it would be like to make this kind of pot again. I used to invest so much time and effort into the surface works. My current pots are really more simplistic, and as a result of that, my throwing has improved so much more because I've been investing more in the throwing and less on the surface. So it's like, I wonder what it would look like if I made that pot again. And here is like one of my absolute favorite pots that I produced a couple weeks ago. And I just love the simplicity of this form. That's it.